Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. In the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of all of living nature, I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As we conclude today, a 5-day program on how humanity has come to a reckoning around the wounds of race. We began the week commemorating on April 4th, the anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King. And we're concluding the week with the news just last night out of Washington, D.C. In the United States that the first Black woman, Ketanji Brown Jackson, has been confirmed by the U.S. Senate to be justice on the Supreme Court. Only the sixth woman to be elevated to the court, and the first Black American woman. So there are complexities with race. There are small triumphs as we move along. And it's in that spirit that we've convened this whole program on reckoning with the wounds of race. It's an acutely American issue for reasons that most of you know, but it's also a generic human issue that people in different places and at different times have grappled with. So we're going to be concluding our 5-day program. We've had a number of programs over the nearly 2 years that Humanity Rising has been convening. And this will be a theme as we move down the road, I'm sure. Before we jump into our program, let us just take a moment and just pause in all the hustle and bustle of our lives, all the complexities, all the challenges that we face. The pandemic, the invasion of Ukraine, all the news compresses us. It's causing stress. So one of the things that we like to do as we start our programs every day is just to take a minute and center yourself in your body. Take a breath, close your eyes if you can, and center your attention on your heart for the next minute in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving. Commune with your heart. Let us this day just rejoice with Ketanji Brown Jackson, who is now a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Thank you, everyone. Now it's my real pleasure to introduce Dr. Karoy Ferguson, who has convened this program and has convened most of our programs actually since the beginning of Humanity Rising on matters related to race. Cuff, deeply appreciate everything that you've done for Humanity Rising. These programs over the last few days have been just profound and stellar. And so now as we come to our final session, it's with deep gratitude that I want to express to you on behalf of all of us that I turn the program over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Jim, so much. And it's actually been a wonderful honor and pleasure to be with everyone and Ubiquity University and Humanity Rising for this past week. So I'm very honored, to be in the presence of everyone. And hopefully, as we bring up the rear, as they say, for this week, we brought together what I consider some very powerful voices, trying to deal with this, the whole subject of reckoning with the wound around race. So thank you again for allowing us to be here. One of the things that I wanted to do initially was just to walk us back a little bit through the journey that we've been traveling through this week. And I want to tap that off a little bit with a song. Music has a way of getting to the soul. And so I wanted to do that initially before I introduced the panelists, because I didn't want to interrupt our flow as we get into conversation. So part of the journey for this week has been trying to frame a conversation, which I hope will be an ongoing conversation, about how we, as a human species, can indeed grapple with that reckoning, because it's a deep psychic wound that's at play. And so we've been trying to bring in a variety of voices from a variety of perspectives to share their views about what it really means to engage in that process. So we brought in elders, African-American elders in the beginning. Then we brought in the voices of the youth. And then we brought in the voices of the women. And yesterday, there was a discussion having to do with what might be important to just entertain as a possibility for a psychology that might be helpful for humanity to engage as a way to bring back the whole subject of human dignity. And that was humanistic psychology. And then today, we're going to see if we can do a broad look through these powerful voices to share their thoughts about ways in which we might manage and perhaps even heal some of the wounds that have to do with race. But when you try to gauge this subject, as Jim was alluding to, there are times when it gets difficult, and we're living in difficult times. And sometimes when we're living in difficult times, it gets hard to breathe. So as a way of trying to bring some context and musical interlude to our conversation, I wanted to just play a little song, which is called Breathing. But again, it is sung by this group that I've fallen in love with called Acapop Kids, because it's a multiracial group. And they sing a cappella. But the blend of their voices, the blend of that energy is so symbolic for what might be a possibility of the blending of energies having to do with race relations. And so I'm going to ask Georg if you could tee that up for us.
ladies.
Yes, let's just keep on breathing. Where there's breath, there's life. Where there's life, there's hope. And so, in that spirit, I want to bring our panelists on so we can have some discussion about ways in which we might go about dealing with and reckoning with this race-linked wound. So I'm going to ask the panelists, can you turn your cameras on so people can see you? Okay. So we have three wonderful voices with us today, and I just want to say a word or two about them. And then if they have any opening remarks they want to share, we'll turn to them individually, and we'll go from there. So we have with us today Dr. Tahira Abdullah, and she's an associate professor at UMass Boston. And her area of expertise actually has to do with mental health among African Americans and mental illness stigma, looking closely at culture, identity, and mental health and in African Americans and the barriers that come into play around health. And so at the university, she does have a program there, a research program that deals with these issues. And it's rooted in the recognition that African Americans are not a monolithic group, and that many cultural factors may bear on the mental health outcomes of the effectiveness of standard interventions. So hopefully she can share some thoughts with us about that and some other subject matters that we might get into. Then we have Dr. Tony Vandermeer. And Dr. Vandermeer has his Master's of Science in Community Economics and also a PhD in Leadership and Change. And he's a senior lecturer at UMass Boston. So we have a kind of this UMass Boston Alumni Association coming together today, which I'm very appreciative and grateful for. And Tony is, Dr. Vandermeer has also been a social justice activist, for well over 40 some odd years. So hopefully he'll bring that perspective to the whole subject of reckoning and helping with us to think through possibilities for how to go about healing and addressing some of the wounds that are at play. And he's also a spiritual practitioner in a particular tradition that grows out of the Yoruba region of Africa. So, and then finally we have attorney Joseph D. Feaster, and it's also a doctor, juris doctor. Now, I was telling Joe before this whole program, I was trying to put together his bio. When I looked at things, I said, my goodness, this bio could be about 2-3 pages long. So I had to cut it down a little bit if people get a hold of the program. But he's currently actually serving in the role of chair of the Urban League, which is an important role in Boston and Massachusetts. And he's a former chair of the NAACP. He's just so many different roles that he's played over the years. He's a lawyer with the firm of McKinsey and Associates, a court-appointed receiver of the Roxbury Comprehensive Community Health Center. He has a long and highly significant and impactful roles in a number of different arenas. These include, for example, president of the Massachusetts Community and Banking Council, acting director of real estate for Massachusetts Turnpike Authority, interim administrator of a housing authority, and the list goes on and on. So I could wax on for almost an entire program listing all of the things that you have been engaged in. So welcome to you all. And I'm just going to ask if each of you have any kind of opening comments you want to make before we actually enter into a conversation. So I'm going to turn to the lady first.
Thank you.
I grew up in the South, so we're very polite when we're from the Southern tradition.
I hear that. I'm from the South too.
All right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ferguson, for that introduction and for your role in convening this space. I didn't prepare any opening remarks, but I think the things that I want to say that are coming to mind off the top right now are just that I think that having these conversations about race-linked wounds, about racism-related stress, and the responses that we have to this, really abnormal and abhorrent experience of racism is really important for us to talk about. And even more important than talking about kind of the stress and trauma that's related to that, I think, is the conversation around like, how do we uproot racism, from the roots, and really thinking about when we're thinking about our responses to racism, that it's not all about coping with this horrendous institution. It's about how do we undo the things that are at the root of it. So I hope that we have a chance to go there at some point in this conversation, and I'm really looking forward to how this unfolds. Thank you.
Right. Okay. How about you, Dr. Vandermeer? Want to share any thoughts, opening thoughts?
Sure. Thank you. And again, I appreciate you allowing me to share space with everyone today. I would just start from the video that you played on Breathe In, and that when you talk about race-linked wounds, that what you are talking about is a predicament that many Black Americans and, in fact, many people find themselves that they can't breathe. I mean, this is the George Floyd piece, I can't breathe. And this is what happens when we engage in institutions and in a world, and particularly in a nation. They're still debating on whether they're going to treat us as human beings or not, or as equal partners or not. Joe is actually the lawyer, but when you really deal with a society in which we've been treated as non-persons, right, to the point where they abolished slavery and then incorporated us into the Constitution in terms of being part of the society, but then not giving us the full benefits of that. And so that wound is something that has been going on for a long time, and it's something that we have to address and to undo. But it's a lot to undo. It's and part of it is to actually deal with the consciousness that people have in believing that some people are superior and some people are inferior. Because that's when we talk about racism, we have to really deconstruct what that actually is, and who have the power to continue to manufacture this idea through all kinds of symbols and all kinds of ways of doing that. So, we have to remember that the knee is still on our neck, and that we're still trying to breathe, because that's been the mantra, I can't breathe. And it feels like that sometimes on a daily basis, even at the university, we're saying, I can't breathe. We have to go and get some air. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Tony. And Fisa, you want to share your opening remarks with us?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ferguson. I'm going to address you here with that, and I'll go to Cuff because we have a personal relationship, having served on the Dimmitt Community Health Center board in the past. But I want to say, yes, I'm from the South too. I'm from New York, and that's south of here. So we too have an appreciation for respect for our women that was ingrained in me early on in my upbringing. And I want to take a lead from my dear friend Dr. Vandermeer on his reference to the breathing clip. I thought that was so profound and so appropriate for here. But I want to, as we talk about this, Black folks have to take a deep breath. That's what I took from that. You know, for what's been going on historically for us, we consistently have to take a deep breath. I will also talk about it because I see, and I always begin by telling folks, I am a direct beneficiary of the civil rights movement, having come here to Boston to attend college in '67 at Northeastern University. That I came immediately following the civil rights movement, the death of JFK, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and then when there was an effort by the universities after what was taking place with the Black Power movement and all of those things to bring some of us into these white institutions. I'm a direct beneficiary. As we talk, and I saw Professor Abdullah with mental health, I mean, I live and breathe the mental health issue, having lost my son to suicide in 2010. I'm involved with the mental health and just helped the family the other day get someone processed and committed on a Section 12. And I know Professor Abdullah knows what that is in the sense of that just the other day, because folks know I'm outspoken. And then lastly, in this conversation, there, as we talk about what has occurred with Black folks, there have been some triumphs, such as the vote regarding Ketanji Brown Jackson yesterday. But I also think about Thurgood Marshall. I think about Vice President Kamala Harris. I think about President Obama. But I also think about Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Rosewood, Florida. I think about George Floyd and Trayvon Martin. I think about Dr. Keith Motley. I think about what's going on with the immigration policy and how, even with regards to Ukraine and how the Black and brown folks are being treated in that regard. I think about the insurrection, and of course, I think about mental health. So as we engage in this conversation, these are the types of things which make me have to take a deep breath. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a broad stroke, and indeed, it is something that's at play in at least all of our lives that sit on this panel today. And I wanted to turn our attention a little bit to what I think I've characterized as our visible wounds, the visible wounds, as well as the invisible ones. And I'm happy to say a word or two about what you see from based on your own experiences and based on what you know about what's been happening in the United States, and indeed, if you want to share stuff about what's happening in the world globally, what do you see as some of the more visible wounds that need to be dealt with, and what are some of the more invisible ones that you think may be at play? You want to take a crack at that? I know, Tony, you have to leave at a certain point, so I want to ask you to share some of your thoughts.
So in terms of the visible wounds and the invisible wounds, you know, let me take a crack at that. Let's if we would try to kind of deconstruct, and I'm not a psychologist, but I want to use this word, deconstruct the psychology of what happened at the Oscars. You know, is that in some ways there's a visible wound, because what happened is that is put at the plate in many ways within the Black community, in terms of the kind of behavior or protocol or how they feel that Black people are supposed to respond to their conditions. And so, you know, the invisible piece is that the kind of pain that Black people carry inside of them in their professions, you know, and I'm sure that many of us, whether it was in a courtroom or, you know, in negotiating something or, you know, working with someone where we had this anger or, you know, to address something, but for some of us has been able to catch it because, you know, as Dr. Harding says, that when people are dehumanized, they get angry, and anger goes into rage, and you can almost predict violence when the question of rage, and so we can see that visibly playing out, in communities in terms of how this set of self-destruction end up happening on other people of color. And when you really look at it, that the Oscars, even if there's a Black president, or if there are Black people who are operating that Oscar, who is it really controlled by, and whose paradigm are we operating on, and what are those internal feelings and contradictions that begin to come about? And so there's a lot of, not only that they treat us as being invisible, but there's a lot of things that we have to suppress, in terms of able to thrive in the structures and in the cultures that we exist, that is based on more of a white supremacist framework, of white supremacist ideology. Even when we talk about psychology, there's a struggle around, whose ideas and from what cultural perspective and so forth, and not looking at an indigenous, African or native, ways of being and dealing and healing. It comes from a very Eurocentric piece, which takes precedent. Like when you go, if Joe had to go to court and get someone to deal with the psychological, perspective, they're not going to bring in, somebody from Africa who does traditional healing. They're going to look for someone in one of these clinics that's supposed to be legitimized. So there's a lot of things that we tend to that we can see that starts to manifest in terms of the wounds. You can see it on people's faces. You can see it in communities in terms of the level of I don't know the clinical definition of depression, but what I see to be is the depression, around folk. But it's almost in some ways you have a ticking bomb, that exists in many of us based on the historical conditions in which Black people have been treated. And it's really a question of when will it explode? But more than it exploding, is the question is, what do we do to prevent it from exploding, right? How do we go to I heard someone talk about the root cause of these wounds in order to address it. And so far, I don't see that happening, in terms of the system. It's something that the people who hurt themselves have to do and learn to take control of.
Thank you, Tony. It's for those who may not have watched the Oscars, what Dr. Venemer is referring to is what might be called the slap that that went around the world when Will Smith, the actor.
It was actually the second slap that went around the world. See, what happened is that when they raised that question, they really appropriated or forgot about Sidney Poitier in his film In the Heat of the Night, because that was called the slap. And because it was a smack, because whenever a white person smacked you, you were supposed to accept it, but Sidney Poitier smacked him back. And so it's a different piece, but they want to almost make like that didn't happen because it deals with a different structure versus Will Smith smacking Chris Rock.
Yes, that's absolutely, totally. But thanks so much for bringing that up, because indeed there are ways in which we use certain incidents symbolically to talk to one another, and ways in which we can get caught in some of the symbolism too, when we don't go to the root causes of things. I wanted to segue that into some thoughts having to do with the root causes of what you think are some of the visible and invisible wounds, so that we can at least begin to identify what we may be talking about. So Tahira, you want to share some of your thoughts there?
Yes, sure. Thank you. And thank you for what you shared, Tony, because a lot of what I have to say really, I think, connects to some of that. One of the ways that I see these wounds manifesting is really in how we treat each other, how we interact with each other, and the ways that the patterns that are part of white supremacy are repeated, even, amongst Black people, even amongst people of color more broadly. And I think that that's one of the most egregious and most detrimental ways that these wounds manifest. And I think that a lot of it comes from internalized racism. It comes from in people's internalization of the things that have generationally, for generations, been said to us about who's superior and who's inferior. It comes from our internalization of the idea that there's only one way to be. Our internalization of the idea, like Tony was saying, that our indigenous and African-centered ways of being aren't of value. And I think when we internalize those messages, we repeat a lot of the things that have been imposed on us. We uplift a lot of the things that have been imposed on us, and it leads us to not value ourselves and not value each other. And that comes out in the ways that we treat each other and the ways that we interact with each other.
Thank you. Thank you. Joe, you want to add anything to the visible and invisible?
Certainly, and I'm not going to dwell upon, and I'm glad that Tony raised the issue of the slap, or the second slap heard around the world. I did a podcast on Power Play, which is on YouTube, on that issue there. And if you want to hear my views on that, go look at that YouTube. And so we won't devote the time here. When I thought about the visible wounds, again, I brought historical to the present. And so some of the visible wounds that I see is that the dogs and hoses and the murders that were set upon Black folks, from the beginning of time, the hangings that took place, et cetera. If you're talking about some visible wounds, the job denials and housing denials and loan denials and the environmental injustice, all of these things these are the things which folks are experiencing at the present time. And when I talk about how it manifests itself, or the invisible wounds, and I don't know how invisible they are, I don't know if that's the right denotation or maybe connotation. It's a matter of, one, it's manifests itself in mental illness, which talks about depression. It manifests itself in poor health, which may include stress, and it manifests itself in the violence that takes place within the community, Black on Black crime in terms of the domestic violence, et cetera. So all of these things are that, as far as these way it manifests itself and shows itself, is based upon those types of external pressures which we as Black people experience from the beginning of time, and experience notwithstanding whether I'm practicing as a lawyer, or Professor Abdullah is at the university, or Dr. Vandermeer is at the university. These struggles exist for us. It doesn't matter what station of life that we have as Black people. And as Professor Abdullah said, the white supremacy issue has truly raised its head in a most overt way within the past 4 to 5 years. And I envision that that's going to continue into the future, which will as well increase more ways in which we as Black people will be really trounced upon by society.
Thank you for your views around that. I want to push this a little bit further, just to see if we can get deeper into the whole question of racism, white supremacy as a wound. In some sectors, white supremacy and racism has actually been defined as a mental health problem. One of our mayors here in Boston went on record as defining it that way, as a mental health problem. And I wanted to ask a question having to do with if you see racism as a mental health problem and you're trying to undo racism, not just simply at an individual level, but also at a structural level. What kind of things that come to mind for how might one begin to address? We have approaches for how we begin to address mental health. when we define it that way. But if you were to think about how you began to address it, both at individual and collective level, what are some things that come to mind about how that might be done? I don't want to take that one on.
Well, I think so. Education definitely plays a role. And also it's an education that is based on praxis and ways in which people can apply, because it's really about changing also behavior, right? And so when you think about it as a, the question is, well, why it becomes a mental health problem, because the whole idea of race is something that has been developed. It's not real in the sense that they are races, right? And so, the People's Institute, we did an article in our book, State of Race, and we used the People's Institute for Race Beyond definition as, racial prejudice plus institutional power. And it creates this dialectic pieces that, it creates internalized inferiority on the part of Black people and internalized racial superiority on the part of white people. But also that white people aren't superior and Black people aren't inferior. But for people to think that they're superior, that means there's some disconnect. There is some illusional piece there. But then part of the education asks us, well, who are we and where do we all come from? And so if we operate on the scientific premise that humanity began in Africa, and they were Black people, then that means is that we all share a common ancestry. So what is the dysfunction? And so how do we get people, how could you go through educational institutions and you could be teaching classes and be doctors and judges in places and you don't know this, then that's a problem. But it's how do we begin to create these spaces in which we're sharing that knowledge and that we're sort of correcting people's perception in a way that, we go back to what that reality is versus having people live in this illusion thinking that they are superior, whether they actually acknowledge it, but it's so internalized because that's based on the culture and the politics of the world that we live in. And so we have to go and address that. And it's not education in the classroom per se, but it's within our cultural forms, so that, for example, the video you showed is dealing with a question of breathing. We know that breathing is critical to our existence, but when people can't breathe, how do we get to take that breath, right? And so we have to begin to take it out of the classroom, so it's practiced in our lives. And how do we get that? And it's through the very social systems and political systems that have to be wedded in terms of going to that root cause. Otherwise, people are going to, manufacture and fabricate whatever they want when they got power.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay. So all of this internalization and how it gets acted out, as Tahira was sharing that these things get manifested in the ways in which we interact with one another. And those interactions not only take place at an individual level, but also at a systemic level. And those who are interacting at a systemic level essentially are holding in place some of the beliefs that may be at play that have been internalized, unquestioned, and unexamined. And it's that kind of manifestation that continues in the kind of healing work that needs to take place. Okay. Joe, you want to add a perspective around this? You're muted right now.
I was listening intently to Tony, and I guess maybe I need to listen to my bishop more in order to get closer to the viewpoint about people and their beliefs and the possibilities if they're educated about the fact as one would say that we're all Homo sapiens and we come from the same place. What, unfortunately, my 72 years have taught me that may be something that's discussed, but is not a reality as to how folks are willing to or have approached it. So what I was saying in response to your earlier questions, Cuff, about what are some of the visible wounds and invisible wounds, that's what the manifestation has been. And we've had these discussions at various points in history where I thought that things were going to be changed because folks thought about humanity. And I'll go back to, I thought in 1964, when we passed the voting rights, the Civil Rights Act, that we were on a move towards some type of understanding of that unanimity. It didn't occur. I thought we were going to get it with the Voting Rights Act in 65. It didn't occur. I said I was part of the direct beneficiary of the civil rights movement coming to Boston to go to college in 67. I thought it was going to occur. I thought it was going to occur with the Civil Rights Act of 1968. It didn't occur. I am now at the point of saying, okay, maybe it's occurred, because I call this in the era of George Floyd. It seems like folks want to talk about DEI and we want to have some receptivity and maybe get into that nirvana that Dr. Vandermeer is talking about. I don't know. I don't see it. And maybe, maybe in my years, I've just become more pessimistic because I've become impatient with the fact of the change and people understanding that there really are any differences to respect us for the skills and that we do have. But that just has not manifested itself in these many years. And I don't know how many more years, and I don't think any of us do, that we're going to have on this planet. But the reality is that I'm not seeing any movement from the idea of the supremacy of mindset of white people with regards to Black and brown people. And if someone could show me that there's going to be a change in that regard in the future, I'm willing to hear it.
Okay. Thank you for your wisdom. Tahara, you want to get on this one?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll say, there's so many things that came to mind through as this conversation has unfolded. I think one of the things that is coming up to me, or one of the things that I've been sitting here kind of working through in my mind, is the ways that conceptualization of white supremacy and racism as mental illness can be useful, and also ways that I could see people using that conceptualization in a way that could be problematic. So I'll start with the ways that I think that it is a useful conceptualization. And I think the main reason that it's useful is because it situates the issue where the issue is. It situates the problem within white supremacy. It situates the problem as a problem that really white folks need to be dealing with, as opposed to situating the issue on folks of color as something that we need to be managing or coping with, and all of those sorts of things. And I think that framework is an especially important framework for thinking about how we can actually move forward, how we can actually start to dismantle some of the systemic and individual forms of oppression. My concern with it, though, is that sometimes when thinking about or when talking about mental illness, there's the question of responsibility in a way, or there's a question of control. And oftentimes in conceptualizing mental illness, there's this piece of, well, how much of it is a person able to actually control? And so I want to make sure that we're not removing that responsibility for actually understanding, for actually, acknowledging the ways that white supremacy exists within individual white folks and within this society, because I think that it's important to not lose that as we also are thinking about this conceptualization.
Before, may I just add, because Professor Abdullah just invoked in me another thought, which is those who know me, who may be listening in here, know my personality. And I think you have this question anywhere in terms of the self-determination. I'm not going to hold Black folks not responsible for their own actions. Again, that same historical period that I referred to was a time, Black Power movement in 1965. I thought us coming together. I can remember Tony and I with our afros and our dashikis back then, the time when we were together at Northeast.
I remember those days.
And so I said, wow, this was the time we were coming together. We were talking about, self-determination. We were talking about in terms of manifestation and things in our own community. So I just want to put on the table, I'm not allowing Black people in order to take a pass in terms of that there's not a responsibility in their part. And Professor Abdullah, I'm not suggesting that you said that. You did say that, and that's why I wanted to jump in here now. I'm not giving them a pass. There are things that we have to do. And some of us are, we got to take care of the business. We have to talk about buying within our community. We got to talk about making the types of investments, et cetera. So I'm saying to folks, at least that hasn't been my personality. I'm not looking for anybody to give me anything. I tell folks there's several things I need, because I'm a reparationist. The only thing I do say about it, I want 41 acres because I have nothing to do with the mule. I wouldn't know what to do with the mule. So give me 41 acres. As this bishop once said, I don't want you to teach me how to fish. I don't want you to give me the fish. I just want you to get out of the way and let me get to the stream. So that's where I'm coming from in my total thinking as a Black nation, as a Black person in this society. That has been the motivation that I have, that I speak to people about, and particularly teach my children and my grandchildren, that we have to do some of the things on our own and not look to others to do it for us.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
Yeah, but so you're also provoking another thought, Joe. Is that when you speak,
I love doing that, Tony.
when you speak of a Black nation, that we're speaking because what the Kerner report shows is that Black people are a nation within a nation. But the question becomes, well, what's our authority? What's our power? But is it to be a nation, to be like the nation that has dominated us? Or do we begin to deal with other ways of ideas in terms of how we deal with not only our humanity, but humanity of the world? So do we create a different system? Because what we're finding is that people who try to do that, Cuba, Venezuela, is that folks put their knee on their neck, right? And so, so it's a question of that, yes, I think there has to be transitional programs where we deal with the question of investment, but when we're dealing with people with power, they'll bomb you like they bomb other countries and you lose everything you have. They'll put an embargo on you and take your money, seize everything. So we have to begin to understand, that the question really, and it goes down to, what is freedom? If we want to be a free, independent, sovereign nation, what does that mean? That doesn't mean that we build a swim pool in our living room, right? It means that, we have to begin to deal with our humanity and our dignity and making sure there's just not us who's eating and have a place to sleep, but it's other people in our community and people in the world that we share that sense of nationalism in a sense of that. So I think that because we've been in America for so long, we've been put we've been put in this box, this paradigm, in which our thinking and our practice is based on the people who dominated us. And we have to shift that, because also I think that, yes, we have to take responsibility, but what has been the obstacles of stopping that? Like when we talk about the counterintelligence program, is that they have killed, a person who believed in peace. Dr. King killed the person who believed in self-defense, Malcolm X. And so it really makes no difference who you are, is that a system who don't believe, who don't want you there, will try to take you out. And so the point for us is that how do we, in many ways, know that there are folks who is trying to disrupt your very being, and so which disrupt even you taking those levels of responsibility when we have to. So that's part of the wound. Is that how do we fight when someone has their knee on their neck? And we have to fight. Right? We have to fight. We have to scream. We have to bite. We have to shake, or whatever it takes us to do, we have to do. But that's the level of responsibility, the level of resistance to our oppression, but creating a system that's different than those who've been trying to suffocate us.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
You know, one of the things that I remember writing a while ago was about the connection between that whole desire for freedom and the flip side of freedom. You know, the flip side of freedom is actual responsibility. Because if you're totally free, I mean, totally free, ain't nobody to blame. You have to take responsibility then for your own beingness. And you have to take responsibility for some of your own creations. But that goes, and it goes along with the folks who are creating the kind of systems that are oppressed and are not taking responsibility for the creation of those systems, oppressive systems. And it's when folks, and you were talking about this from the vantage point of folks being able to own, white folks being able to own things that they have internalized around white supremacy. And when they don't, when that isn't owned, you can't deal with something that you don't acknowledge exists. And so that's the challenge, that at least from my point of view, is that's the challenge that many who designate themselves as white have to come to terms with. What does even whiteness mean to them? I did a little talk in a class for one of my colleagues' classes about what it meant to grow up in the segregated South, and asked the question. And the question was, do you consider yourself white? So all the students in the class, who were characterized themselves as white, raised their hands. And I said, well, are you really white? And I held up a piece of paper that was white and said, do you look like this piece of paper? No. But you designated yourself that way. And you've attributed a lot of meaning to it. And people around you see it that way. And how you think about that whiteness, because, the modal color of those who characterize themselves as white, it's not really white, it's really more like pinkish tan.
That's part of the womb, Cuff.
I know, that's the part of the womb. Yes.
That's part of the womb. That's part of the illusion.
There you go. It's part of the illusion of embracing that as a construct and then playing with it around the power that you're talking about, Tony.
Mm-hmm. Because if they use white, then what's the opposite? What they'll say, they say it's black, right? And then that means is then white is what? Then I say, well, superior, then black is it. So that is the wound that we keep trying to get out of.
Right. And one of the things that also occurs to me is, at least in the United States, folks who we now call ourselves like descendants of Africa or African Americans and what have you, but we've gone through many ways of redefining ourselves. So at one point, we were colored. At another point, we were Negroes. And then at another point, we were just simply Black. And then at another point, we said, well, we're Afro-American. And then we're African-American. So it's so folks have been struggling with self-definition, at least internally in the community. But we haven't seen the parallel process on the other end. So except the white folks haven't done that, haven't struggled with the meaning of it all, which then gets into having to question then the whole notion of white supremacy. So those are some thoughts that occurred to me as you were talking about this internalization and the kind of trauma that it's left us with, both not only in the United States, but to some extent globally around how we deal with race.
That for example, Theodore Allen, who talks about the invention of the white race, would you say that they go through it in a different way, in that before they used to be Irish and Scottish and and Italian and so forth, then they become white, when they come here, right? Is there, how would you begin to process that shift of embracing this piece of American being white? Because that's what it has been for us, because this is what Du Bois talks about, in Souls of Black Folks, in terms
Yeah.
of, this double consciousness, around they reject you from being, Black people from being, American, or which they mean is a word for being white, and won't accept you, or in terms of your Blackness and so forth. So it's like, how do we understand who configure it, and what's the solution in terms of how we identify ourselves? And I think you're raising a good point, that it was through the civil rights movement that Joe was talking about, and the Black Power movement, that helped us shift that consciousness, because it was only colored, but colored with a little c, and colored with a capital C, and Negro with a capital N, and Negro with a little n, and so that we're fighting these things versus saying we're human beings and we deserve to be treated like human beings, right? And that's the piece of developing our consciousness, because otherwise we're talking about different ethnicities, which we aren't really addressing in proper form. But the fact that we're all related, and that I think has to be part of the conversation around that, because even the laws, that they're, the way that they're dealing with it, you have to fill a form, or you Afro, whatever you are, it's like we, and then if you're in another country, well, you Venezuelan, so we could put embargo on you, or you Cuban, and we could kill you because we don't send you no medicine or help you get any remittance. It's, we have to figure out, how do we get a broader discussion on our humanity?
Yes.
Can I just chime in? Because
Sure.
at least for me, I sum it up from the standpoint of power and control. Somebody always going to want to be in charge. And if you can subjugate somebody else, you elevate yourself. So Tony said, there were those distinctions on the place of person's ethnicity based upon the country in Europe that they may have come to, until they come to America, because the benefit was in terms of just, hey, and I don't care who it is. The same thing happened with the Jewish community as well. When they came here, in terms of it, they were white, even though in terms of there was persecution that may have taken place where they were. But I also want to comment on the piece which Tony mentioned that says, look, if you push back, yes, there are opportunities to crush folks. And I just want to briefly just point out and just move on. Folks need to look at what happened in Tulsa, and they need Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Rosewood, Florida, that yes, there were communities, vibrant and progressing Black communities. And what did they do? They crushed them and stamped them out and destroyed them. So yes, Tony, you're absolutely correct that even when folks have taken on their self-determination, the power structure will attempt to defeat them by attempting to eradicate them. So the question becomes, I'm listening to you, and I love all you professors in terms of talking about it from the standpoint and examining it. I'm sorry, folks, I'm here on the ground, and my sense is I'm seeing this all the time, and the only thing that I can choose to do is take up the fight in whatever spaces that I can to try to eradicate it. Would I use the law? Would I use politics? Would I use whatever to get to the point to be able to say, in my experiences, I see it, but in my mindset, in terms of there is nobody, no race, nobody that is more superior than me on the personal side, and I'm going to approach it from the standpoint of constantly raising that type of viewpoint. And as I talk to the young people, as I talk to my own children, when I talk to my grandson, I'm telling them, you're as powerful as anybody else, and don't let them ever take that from you.
I think it's a both and. I mean, I don't think that those are mutually exclusive. I don't think, just because there is a power structure that will do all that it can to suppress our self-determination, I don't think that that means that we shouldn't be self-determined, right? Like, it's a both and. So we need to both be on the ground and be investing in our communities, as you were saying, And those power structures need to be, dismantled. I don't think that those things are at all mutually exclusive, that both of them are necessary for us to really move forward.
I have to go, but I want to say that, Joe, I never left the ground. And I'm an anomaly, part of why the university, don't necessarily, give me a hard time is because I'm on the ground, and that, my work that I do on the ground in Atlanta, in North Carolina, and also not just locally, but, nationally, globally, is just the idea, because part of the whole idea is that the name of professor or the name of lawyer, these are titles within the legal structure that we exist in, because the legal is political, right? And as Dr. King said, these are not given laws, these are man-made laws. So I agree with you, is that ain't nobody better than us, but it's how do we defend that, right? And we defend it with life and death, in terms of dealing with that. But I do agree that's what I said. There's a transitional program, because in the meantime, Malcolm X said, while we're here, we got to eat, right? We have to have a place to stay, right? And we have to deal with our health and other kinds of things. But in what context? And so there has to be a cultural shift in terms of the ideas that we function under, and the kind of rebellion that's necessary to transform the system, but not just for ourselves, because even though I like, the question of a Black nation, but it can't exist within itself, it exists within the universe. And so the kind of relationships that we have to have where people are respecting our humanity, in which we respect theirs. And so even if it's within a nation itself and it's within communities, because there's no respect. I mean, and I'm happy that we have a Black woman who's a Supreme Court justice. But the truth of the matter, at this moment, all it changes is perception right now, because like you said, it's dealing with power. And so that's what we have to deal with. So we have to change the structure. We have to change the system, and not just put a Black face where white faces have been, So with that, I have to go to this emergency meeting. Thank you very much for.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you, Tony, before you leave, for doing this. And this is one of the things that Black folks have to deal with, is multitasking in many different ways. And Tony does have an important meeting on campus right now, which is actually struggling with the same kind of issue, having to do with the Africana Studies program. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you, my brother.
Sharing your thoughts.
Yeah.
And,
Tony.
Yeah. All right, everyone.
And I know your history. You have always been on the ground, my brother. I know that for real.
All right. Take care, everyone.
All right.
All right. Okay, so I guess we're down to 2, and we'll continue with our conversation to try to see if we can bring some closure and insights to ourselves as a community that's trying to grapple with, and to help other people to look at the whole issue of a reckoning that's at play. I'm curious also about your views about the future possibilities. When the two of you think about race relations and kind of project out into the future about how you might see race relations in the future in the United States or in the world, what comes to mind, about the future?
Well, again, I got to look at what's what's before me, and of course, to say if we don't know our history, sometime we'll, of course, repeat, particularly some of the negative things. So let's take what's I'm going to take what's in the news now. Okay. As an example where I think, and I'm going to try to be global in my in my response, looking at the world, because this is a world stage, and then I'll try to bring it home and maybe even bring it local to here to Massachusetts. So what's played out in the news is what's going on in Ukraine. And I saw the rallying of the world community with regards to that, the United States, the European countries coming to the aid of Ukraine in an unprecedented way. I'm a political science. I graduated political science at Northeastern back in 1972, and we studied all of those things. The Soviet Union still existed back when I was there, and I studied political science. I studied France and Germany and the Great Britain. So we studied all those systems, and so we understood how that worked. And we talked about NATO, we talked about the UN, et cetera. They came together with regards to this. Well, the Black and brown people that were engaged there were treated like they weren't even part of that experience. And in fact, the racism manifested itself in there on the world stage. But for some of the Black media that spoke about the issue, you would have thought that that was a non-issue. So my sense was, in my response, have things changed? No, I was looking at it in 2022. That's an example right in my face. And I'm not even going to get into what wasn't done with regards to Haiti, what wasn't done with regards to Sudan, what wasn't done in terms of the Arab nations. So across the world, I look at who's sitting in NATO. I don't think I saw a Black delegate in any of those conversations. So it's still there. So that's what I saw on the world stage, and just glaringly in there, and it didn't sit well with me as I observed it there. I didn't even see the United States make any big comment. There's nothing that came from the Biden administration with any recrimination with regards to that type of treatment. We were silent, in my view, and maybe I missed the newscast or two on that particular issue. So we went straight for that. And then I say, well, fine, you're asking me as a Black person to contribute to it, and billions of dollars are being spent out of here, and I just about to pay my taxes in a couple of weeks, and I'm saying, well, maybe I need to be a libertarian and be able to decide how I want to spend my money. But that's a whole nother discussion, so let me not get there. Then I come to the United States, and I see what took place with the nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson. And I sat there in horror and looked at the treatment that she experienced there, in contrast to the two most recent nominees to the Supreme Court, with her experience having well beyond almost any of them who have sat on that court in the most recent years, and how she was castigated. And then in terms of the vote, and yes, we can be happy with what transpired with the vote, but a 53-47 vote with all the Republicans walking out of there except for Senator Romney. I mean, so you can't tell me that race relations are getting better. Then I look at what's going on in the states since the so-called lie of the big steal in terms of the vote, and all of these laws that are being passed in order to disenfranchise people, particularly Black people, more particularly Black women, because they were very on the forefront in most of those elections that took place. So you can't tell me that race relation is getting better. I look at the rise of the white supremacy movement, which manifested itself in a great way on January 6th. And in terms of, and I hearken back, and I have a conversation with my wife and others saying, well, if those were Black people, there would have been so many dead bodies around the Capitol on that particular day, or the arrest. We can't even get one. I mean, the folks that, as far as I see, most of them who were involved with that, they have gotten a slap on the hand, and those who were responsible for it are playing such a nice game that they're going to run out the clock on this January 6th committee and no one's going to be held to justice to that, when I think the situation would be differently. And as one person put in the chat, they said, wow, I thought things were going to be different with when we got President Obama. Well, let me just give you a wake-up call. Nothing changed as a result of that. So you ask me what I think about, and then I'm not even going to get into that. We're happy to see that there was some justice made with regards to the police officer Chauvin, with regards to the murder of George Floyd, et cetera. And we're accepting that, oh, the system's going to change, that there's going to be accountability that's going to take place there, that there's going to be opportunities in terms of build back better to make things better in our community. I'm sorry, folks, Feaster's not buying that things are going to change. Now, hey, I'm basing it upon my lived experience. Yes, I had the opportunity to come to school in '67. I can harken back to when I came here in '67. My parents came to pick me up in '68. We couldn't even stop on the way back to New York City at a place to get something to eat. And that's in 1968 in terms of doing it. So my sense is, yes, there have been some gains that have been made, and there may be some people with sensitivity, but I think the noose is tightening, no pun intended, on the issue of race relations, such that folks are again into the power grab across the board, saying these Black and brown folks are going to outnumber us in a couple of years. We need to lock this down. We need to maintain our power and our control. And if you ask me about the future, it is going to worsen than get better.
Okay. Thierry, you have any thoughts about the future?
Yeah, I do. And truthfully, a lot of them align with Joe. I mean, I do think, you've outlined all of those examples, the ways that things haven't changed. And, even from the work that I do, when I look at the materials that I'm using that some would say should be outdated because they're old, but are still relevant and applicable in the same ways that they were, 20, 30, 40 years ago, I think to me, that's a sign that there unfortunately is not much that's changed. And there's so much work that still needs to be done. And I think the other thing that I'll say about this, and I don't know if you were going to bring this up later or not, Cuff, but one of the things that I think that I have personally found important is still in the midst of recognizing how similar things are to how they were in the past, recognizing how much work there is that still needs to be done to still recognize and hold all of that and try to maintain some hope for the future. And so that's the space that I try to stay in, although it admittedly is challenging at times. But there's a quote by Dr. King where he said, we must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. And I think that that's a really important thing. That speaks to all of the things that could be considered disappointments or are just reifications of the same cycle, reiterations of the same cycle, reifications of the same patterns. And yet being able to maintain hope, to me, is a form of resistance, is a form of courage, and helps me feel that all of the efforts that I and that others are engaging in to resist racism aren't in vain or aren't pointless, and that we can at some point make some strides for future generations, because I don't know if it's going to happen within my generation, but for future generations. And so I try to hold on and maintain that.
Yes.
Cuff, can I just go?
Sure.
I'm sorry, because I've learned how to do these things. I'm looking at the chat, and there's some comments in there which I think should be responded to. A person asked, do we think that the Poor People Campaign movement will move things? And my answer to that is absolutely. To me, there are certain types of power. There is financial power, there is political power, and unfortunately, Black folks have neither. And so my sense of it is, if we're going to influence any of the shift of power, then we're going to have to move toward at least the political power. And that was demonstrated in the last presidential election, that if you engage in the political process. So anybody who tells me that if they don't vote and my vote doesn't count, et cetera, I'm sorry, then you aren't part of the conversation in my world. So therefore, that's one. The other one, I am a strong, I said I'm a reparationist, keep the mule, just give me an extra acre. So I'm clearly there. But the other place where I am is this: I've moved from, and it goes back to what I said, don't give me the fish, don't teach me how to fish, get out of the way, let me get to the stream. My view is we have to, I'm into the accumulation of wealth. We had the study here in Boston, the Fed study a number of years ago, which said the average white person has a net worth of about $258,000, I think it was, and the average black person was $8. You can't have, I don't care, you can have as much hope and et cetera. When you don't have either political power or financial power, what hope can you you're relying on somebody else's largesse. And to me, that's not sufficient. That's the reason why my father drove a cab in New York for 37 years, but he and my mom provided the foundation to make me understand. I think earlier, both Professor Abdullah and Dr. Vandermeer talked about education. All of those things are things that we need to do. So we need to talk about the education. We need to talk about voting. We need to talk about the accumulation of wealth. We need to talk about coming together. We need to talk about buying amongst ourselves. And I'm not talking about a black nation. That's not what I was inferring early on, and nor am I stating here right now. What I am saying is, I can think of many other communities, the Asian community, the Caribbean community. When they come to the United States, they come and they buy and support, and amongst others. And so they may come live in one house for a period of time. Next thing, they own the whole block. We need to begin to be thinking in those terms as coming together, some collectivity in the sense of trying to address our own destiny. So what I said earlier, I'm not letting folks off the hook. They need to find a pathway. They just can't sit down and resign themselves, and they have to be treated by Professor Abdullah on the question of their mental illness and depression because they feel that there's no hope. We got to have hope. Notwithstanding what I'm talking about is what I see on the horizon. I'm never going to give up my hope. I'm never going to feel dejected. I'm not going to ever feel that I'm less than, but my sense is I want folks to also see the reality of the pressures upon which they're going to be facing, and they'll have to come to their own conclusions as to how they might be able to address it.
Yep, exactly. Once again, it's a both and, right? It's not about hope alone. Obviously, no, hope alone isn't going to get us anywhere, but it's hope as a pathway to resistance, whatever that might look like, whether that looks like education, whether that looks like voting, whether that looks like, financial empowerment. Hope can be a pathway for those things, and I think is a necessary thing. Otherwise, if you're hopeless, then what's the point? And if things are so dire, I've been in my job for going on 10 years now. I don't have enough money to buy a home. I could just give up hope. If I have no hope, then there's no point in trying. And so hope is a pathway for continuing to try to do all of the things that you talked about.
There's a connection a lot then between hope and proaction. So one can, the hope actually just is an energizer for moving forward. But you have to take the action in order to make things happen. If you don't take the action, then you're left in that space of just simply hoping. And if you're simply in the space of hoping, then that future is still at a distance. I said this the other day. It keeps it into the future as opposed to bring it into the present. So we bring that into the present through our actions, being proactive, which brings me a lot to the whole notion of the kinds of things that I know both of you are doing in the community. and trying to be proactive in the community to help folks to feel empowered, to be empowered, and to not sit in the space of hopelessness and inaction. Because that's very easy to do, is to get into that space of inaction. Oh, I can't do anything. Oh, it's too much to do. Oh, it's too big. And the moment we get into that kind of mindset of thinking, then we don't move forward, either individually or collectively. So I want to leave people with that sense of hope, but also tying it in with trying to be proactive and trying to heal this deep wound within the human psyche, and this deep wound in our collective psyche as it pertains to the whole issue of race. Okay. Mindful of, go ahead.
If I might, I just want to say thank you to you for having this session and having my fellow panelists on here. And I, again, when you say something, you invoke a thought in my mind. This is action. I could be off doing billable hours right now, but that's right. I won't tell them how much I would get, but I can tell you I'm moving towards wealth. But my sense is I'm committed to the action side. I want to try to encourage others, so I'm willing to take the time to engage in this conversation, to say to folks, this is the real deal, but Cuff Ferguson, Joseph Feaster, Tahira Abdullah, we have a plan that if you're interested in, we can help you in. I mean, Professor Abdullah talked a lot about mental health, and we didn't dwell upon that here, but that's a major piece for me because of the lived experience that I'm talking about of having lost my son to suicide and what I've seen to others, or the person who I just helped recently with their child, which is really an adult, not a child, in the sense of getting one committed in order because they're having a mental health issue. So what I'm saying is, yes, unfortunately, folks, I have to say to you, if you're not prepared to be in the game, I'm sorry. I used to play poker. You can talk about how great you can play poker off to the side, but the real thing is when you're sitting at that table with your money on the table, it's a whole different experience. And all I'm just saying, to go to what you said, Cuff, there has to be an action plan. And I just want to underscore for that person who asked about the people movement. I know the good reverend out of Texas, the president of the NAACP there, and the actions on the people movement. That grassroots piece has been one of the things that has sustained us over the years, that brought us out of history, brought us out of slavery, because people were willing to put their life on the line for us. And I don't see that same type of impetus as we go forward. And folks, I'm not saying you got to put your life on the line, but you got to have an action plan.
Well, on that note, I want to, because we're coming up on time here, I want to be a little self-serving here, because there's a book that I actually put together, that was written for times such as these. And it was inspired. It came from the inside out. It was almost as if this book was being written by me and my higher self. And contained in it is some hopeful things, but it's also, there's some tools in here that people might want to take a look at. And let me see if I can do a share here just to let you see what it is. And I mentioned this before on this side. It's called Evolving the Human Race Game, a Spiritual and Soul-Centered Perspective. And part of what that is trying to get at is that as human beings, we need to move to a whole nother level of consciousness, to evolve our consciousness if we indeed are going to try to heal this very deep wound having to do with race. And that deep wound, because things are so internalized at this point, and I was trying to get into a very deep place around it. It took me to this very spiritual and really soul level to try to understand what was going on. And so this is the product of that. But at the same time, contained in it was some of the things I've alluded to in some of these sessions. It's where we stuck in terms of playing 3 race games right now, human race games, how to evolve out of those games through what I call a transformational human race game, and how to begin to embrace 3 more broader human race games that gets us into a different kind of consciousness. And contained in it is also some issues having to do with some tools that people can use. So I just wanted to share that as a way to do this. And one of the interesting tools that I'm going to end with this and bring Jim back in has to do with and if anybody's on this call that wants to try to work with me around this one, and it kind of gets to the challenge of how do you deal with mindsets and mental issues and so forth, and how to bring in technology to help around that. So we have this whole technology having to do with virtual reality at this moment. So part of a tool that might be a possibility is how to engage people in a virtual reality where they actually have to grapple with some of the challenges having to do with race relations, and to create a whole virtual reality for that kind of experience. And I have some very specific things in mind to try to assist in that. The challenge, however, beyond just producing this kind of thing, this virtual reality experience, is the very folks who probably need to use it may not engage it. The folks who are in fact internalize the white superiority may not. So it becomes a way of how to entice them into that process or invite them into that process. Anyway, so I'm going to leave us on that note and invite Jim back to help us get some closure.
Thank you, Cuff. Thank
You're
you,
muted,
Tahira, Joseph. This has been a marvelous conclusion to our program. I want to just add one, I would say, contextual point as we close. Because there's been this discussion about mental health and the challenges that we have given the complexities that you've all laid out, which are really significant. I think another layer that we all need to take in as we grapple with these complexities is that we are now in a world of multiple code reds, where the turbulence, the stress, the hyper complexity, I would say, is radically escalating almost day by day. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change last year said we are now in an unprecedented human situation. The IPCC keeps sending out reports. We're in code red. And what code red means just in terms of climate, according to the United Nations, is that we are now in a period of unavoidable escalating turbulence, in the face of which our governments can no longer ensure stability. Just here in California, we were told just yesterday that this heat dome that's coming over is going to melt most of the snow cap in the Sierra Nevadas, which are already only 38% of normal. Millions of acres won't be planted. I was talking with someone just in Costa Rica yesterday. They get 60% of their corn from the Ukraine. that's just completely dried up, and it dried up without notice instantly. What are the farmers going to do? We're in a code red in terms of democracy. All around the world, authoritarian regimes are rising in power and are coordinating. And there was a poll just this morning out of France that this right-wing woman, Le Pen, is ahead of Macron in the polls. You know, what if we have France turn into an authoritarian state? And in the middle of all this, the stresses, all the mental health, Tahira, you probably know this better than any of us, you know, that, suicides, drug abuse, domestic violence, road rage, everything is going up and up and up and up and up. And the point that I want to make as we close to the final point that you make is, you know, things are getting worse and worse, better and better, faster and faster, which means that there's less and less neutral ground. And so as we move into the future, it seems to me we're in a world in which every choice matters, and every choice is under more and more external and internal psychic pressure in a global situation that is escalating in its turbulence. And how the different moves that we make ricochet through the system, how we as individuals and as communities, whether it's at the level of race or it's the level of preserving our democracy or at the level of doing whatever we can to ameliorate the climate crisis, to say nothing about the political. Well, if you've been tracking the news, Sri Lanka as a country has basically just collapsed as one of the effects of Ukraine, climate, and COVID. So I just want to underscore the conversations that we've just heard in the last hour or so, everyone, is a fundamentally important, very complex conversation that has to do with race. But the racial tensions are connected with all sorts of other political and social aspects of our common human condition, all within now the larger context of escalating turbulence. So humanity, to your final point, Cuff, we've got to very consciously come to terms with the fact that we have to consciously change and evolve so that we can use the pressures that are now impinging upon us for good rather than for ill. Because I think in the next couple of years, the psychic equilibrium will be shattered in ways that we right now find almost unimaginable. And that's probably too serious a point with which to close this session, but it was coming up for me because I wanted to honor the depth to which you were taking all of us by framing it. And I'd like to push just to take 1 minute or two, just in response to what I just said, maybe starting with you, Joe, and then Tahira, and then finally Cuff, just so that we round this out and honor what you were saying within the larger complexity that we're all confronted with at this moment in our history.
Jim, I just have to say kudos to your summary of that. For me, it captured the essence of the remarks from Tony and Tahira and me. And while we may come at it from different places, we eventually get to the same point to what you have just put forward there and the comments from Cuff as well. I think you have summarized it. The world stage and the examples that you've talked about, from mental health to environmental to what's going on politically, is what folks will be confronting as we talk about this human condition and this ability for folks to look at it from the standpoint that we all come from the same place. Is we have to look at it from the standpoint of what's going on in this diaspora entirely. And yes, being a person who follows the politics, yes, I heard about what's going on in France, and there's a concern whether, you know, whether he will be able to survive, in that regard. And that, you know, I've been to Paris and I've watched Paris politics. So I think you are giving folks a food for thought with what Cuff has talked about and what he talked about in the book. I think the bookends are placed for this conversation. And what people have to do is what Tahira, Tony, and I said, and what Cuff underscored. Folks got to determine what is going to be their action plan to address all of this. You know, folks can ignore what the environmental and the climate change issues are to their own detriment. I have never seen in my lifetime places where there are hurricanes and tornadoes and things that are taking place in our lifetime. And if folks don't understand what's going on and what's going to happen in terms of the food insecurities and everything else that you're alluding to, Jim, well, I feel sorry for them. I don't know how many, again, I say, I don't know, none of us know how long we're going to be on this planet, but I'm closer to the end than I am to the beginning. My sense of it is folks better wake up and determine what they're going to do. So I applaud you and Cuff for bringing us together to have this most important conversation.
Thank you. Tahira?
Yes, I will keep my my final comments really brief because I'm actually late to another engagement. But I have really appreciated this conversation, and like Joe said, we come at this from different angles, but end up in the same place. And I really think that moving forward, thinking about where we want to be and what each of us needs to do in an effort to get there. So I think thinking about that on both an individual basis as well as on a collective basis. And that collective piece can be, you know, as small as a family, to a neighborhood, a community, a university, you know, a society, right? So I think we need to really be thinking about this on multiple levels, and that action plan that Joe talked about should be not only an individual action plan, although that is certainly important and we should have that, and we also need those action plans on all of those other levels and all of the other spaces that we're involved in as we work towards this. So I apologize that I do need to hop off, but I'm so appreciative of this conversation, so appreciative of all of the other panelists, Joe and Tony, and so appreciative to you too, Cuff, for inviting me to be part of this. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Bye, Tahira.
Cuff, a quick last word.
Yeah, the thing that occurs to me as a way to leave people is to suggest that many of the things that we are experiencing right now are calling our attention, almost like a mirror, calling our attention to the nature of our interdependence. And that's a very profound place to be in. So we are, the whole idea of simply saying intellectually that we're interdependent, we can say that, but what's being mirrored back to us right now is when something happens on this part of the planet, it impacts on things on the other part of the planet. When something happens with Mother Earth, it impacts on everybody who is on this little tiny planet in the cosmos. So that the nature of what it really means to be interdependent is being mirrored back to us in very profound ways at this moment. And it's calling us to say, look, if you're really going to understand the nature of interdependence, you got to evolve to a different level of consciousness so that it's not something that we get reactive to. We can become more proactive in creating the kind of conditions where our interdependence actually is leading us toward the healthiest, most optimal way that we can be. And that's at the core for me is having to do with those tensions that we started the whole conversation around, which has to do with what does it really mean to collaborate and to be in balance? And what does it really mean to have equity?
Mm. Thank you, Cuff. Thank you, Joseph. This has been a splendid week, Cuff. My God, this has been profound and very illuminating. I'm deeply thankful for your leadership and your ongoing support, because these are the kinds of conversations, everyone, that we try to instigate and make available to you through Humanity Rising, because humanity can only rise if it really understands the complexity and within that context takes right action. So thank you all. That'll bring our session to a close today. Have a good weekend, everyone, and we're going to see you again on Monday. And to Cuff's final point, we're going to have a whole session with an Englishman on the crisis of connection that humanity is facing in an interconnected world in which everyone feels disconnected. How do you put those dots together? So thank you, everyone. We'll see you again on Monday. Bye for now.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right.
Great program, guys. Great program.